what are the top 3 ally tips? I'm like, oh yes, I'm ready, And one of them is be really clear about where your sphere of influence is. Where can you make an impact? The more time you spend pouring your energy into places where you can't make an impact, the more frustrated you are, the more disempowered you are, the more sad and burnt out you are.
Trystan Reese, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
I am so happy to be talking to you today. I'm just so grateful to you for spending the time with us. So let's start off by, if you wouldn't mind telling us a bit about what you do professionally and what your journey was to this point.
Sure. Well, I'm a solopreneur. I run a consulting firm called Collaborate Consulting. To be honest, it sounds a little wonky, but ultimately what I do is I teach adaptation to people. So that's like at the very core what I do. What that looks like is I do a lot of training and facilitation on lines of difference, because I think that's the most powerful opportunity for us to be authentic to ourselves and to understand other people, and then to be that bridge person who's able to adapt authentically to connect with others. So I do lots of training on LGBTQ employees and culture. I do a lot of work around pronouns and, creating trans inclusive environments. I do a lot on neurodiversity, a lot on like conflict and communication, intercultural communication, and then some coaching as well. Sometimes people need a little extra TLC, and I like to work with them one-on-one when it makes sense. I also do some consulting, helping systems be more adaptive, but training is really the thing that I love doing. And I'm sure like a lot of the people that you interview, it was a strange, kind of circuitous path to get here. I never wanted to be the boss of anything. I never wanted to be a business owner. But having come out of the LGBTQ movement, I fought on the front lines of some of the movement's biggest fights over the last 20 years. I worked on gay marriage in, I think, 12 different states, including California, for the No on Proposition 8 campaign. I worked on transgender non-discrimination campaigns all over. I worked to repeal the death penalty in both California and Washington. So I did a lot of organizing for a lot of years, stayed in the social justice movement, the nonprofit movement, and, just kind of hit a point where I thought, what if I did my side hustle, which was training and coaching and consulting, as my full-time hustle? And what if I was my own boss? And it turns out I am a great boss to myself. So I'm also a great employee to myself. So that's ended up being really wonderful. It gives me the flexibility I need to take on the kind of projects that really feed me, where I can have a big impact. And I'm a parent to 3 kids, ranging in age from 7 to 17. And so I like the ability that, I have the opportunity to drop things almost all the time and go and show up for them if they need it.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is you don't have a lot of free time.
I don't have a lot of free time, but I have a lot of flex time. That's kind of how I think about it. Is like, here's a time when there's a few things I could be doing. What do I want to do right now? What do I choose to do? And, I promise I'm going to be as optimistic as possible during this conversation, but I have a lot more free time now than I've ever had before, because the Trump administration has made a lot of what I do functionally illegal. So I'm trying to see the positives of that, spend as much time with my kids as I can. And also, it's a really tough time to be a trans person doing any kind of work, especially work that happens to be trans focused in some ways.
Yeah. And I'm definitely going to ask you more about that. Before we get to that, I want to ask you, was there a defining moment in your journey that really shaped who you are today and the work that you do today?
Oh, that's too big a question, Catherine.
What?
A defining moment.
Maybe.
I think my earliest, when I was little, I was 10 years old, I got a book called 101 Ways Kids Can Save the World. And one of the recommendations is to become a vegetarian. And I was like, I could do that. And with being a vegetarian meant that when I hit 6th grade, when I was 11, in biology class, they told us we had to dissect frogs or else we would get an F in the class. And by then I'd been a vegetarian for a year. And I'm really, really lucky. My mom, who cooked all our meals for us, she said, if you're willing to sacrifice something for what you believe in, I'll support you. And so she only cooked vegetarian food for us at home in solidarity, for this journey that I was on. So by the time I was 11, I felt very empowered. And I told my biology teacher that I wasn't going to do that. I'd do anything else. He refused and said he was going to give me an F. And so I staged a walkout at the school. I called all the local news stations. I'm from a very small town. The news stations came. There were cameras. Everyone ditched except for me. So it was a one-person walkout. But a couple hours in, the superintendent showed up to the school and said, okay, fine, we'll change the curriculum. Will you just tell the cameras that this is taken care of and send them home? So when I was very young, I learned that it doesn't matter if it's just you. It doesn't matter if you're only 11 years old. If you take a stance and tell your story, you could make a big change. And, bless their hearts. They really created a monster by letting me win that early fight, because I've spent the last 30 years doing almost that exact same thing. And sometimes it's been not quite as smooth in terms of changing hearts and minds, but that was a very pivotal moment for me. And I've been riding that wave ever since.
I love that so much. Like you learned at such a young age that you can make change. And I think, one of my sort of driving philosophy in life, if I have one, is that sentence: you can make change. And I spend a lot of time and energy telling people, like, you can. And I think that's just such an incredible story that demonstrates the impact you can have. And I love that you learned that at that age.
Thanks to my parents, really. They took me to Michael's to get the poster board and got me the glitter puff paints. They did all the things because they thought that it was really brave what I was doing. And I appreciate that. And I try to pass that on to my kids as well.
That's awesome. I love that so much. So Trystan, when you think about the world that you would like to create in your work, when you think about, what is this sort of better end state that the world would end up in through the work that you do, what does that look like?
I think the answer is both complicated and simple. And I'm thinking about a really beautiful quote from James Baldwin that I read recently. And he said, he was a Black writer, activist, organizer, storyteller. And he said, white Americans don't actually need to love Black Americans. They need to love themselves. When you love yourself, there's no longer any need to hate others. And so I think for me, that's my ideal state, is people who are really grounded and confident and sure of themselves, who know who they are, they know where they come from. And from that deep self-knowledge and self-acceptance and self-love, pretty much everything else opens up. When I get transphobic messages, direct messages on social media, things like that, every single person, it's so obvious to see, is just really is in a lot of pain and really, really does not love who they are. And that's hard to see and witness. It's hard to bear witness to. It's also very hard to fix. It's not easy to fix. So I think if I were to say one thing, would be a world of people who are really secure, confident, knowledgeable about themselves. And I think that makes you really unafraid of whatever else anybody else is. Why would it be a threat if a transgender man in Portland is trying to just live his own life? Why? That's not a threat if you feel super good about who you are.
Right. So if we're grounding sort of in the current moment that is so far away from that beautiful vision and feels not only far away, but under intentional aggressive attack, how do you keep hold of that vision?
I think I learned a long time ago, working in the LGBTQ movement, we lost a lot of fights. Like, I'm old enough that I was there when we were losing. I have this tattoo on my arm and it's just the number 1856. And people are often like, what is that? And it's the ordinance number of a ballot measure I worked on in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And it was my first winning campaign. And I was the director of the entire field operation. So every volunteer, they worked under me. Every organizer, they worked under me. And one very late very sad night when we were pretty sure we were going to lose, I promised them I would get a tattoo if we won. And that sort of pushed their energy over the edge. And we won. And it was the first winning campaign I ever worked on. And it was years in the making. And so I think I learned a long time ago that sometimes the biggest thing is neither the most important thing nor the thing to kind of pin all your hopes on. And I had to tell my organizers, my volunteers for years that we can't put our self-worth on them. Like, it's not up to the voters to tell us who we are, how good we are, whether we're worthy of getting married or having a job or walking down the street, honestly. We've got to find that in ourselves. We've got to do it for each other. And so I just continue to look to my community. I continue to look for leaders. And I think I continue to look for this little things, the little victories. If I'm coaching someone and there's that aha moment, it's okay, yes, I'm doing it, and that ends up being kind of how I'm able to make it through right now.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was how you define success. How do you define success globally, and then how do you define it at the moment? And I think it relates a little bit to what you were just saying, but so, on a global scale, how is success defined for you? And then what does that look like in the here and now?
Yeah, I can't think globally right now. I just can't. I have to be really real. And when I work with allies and they say, what are the top 3 ally tips? I'm like, oh yes, I'm ready, and one of them is be really clear about where your sphere of influence is. Where can you make an impact? The more time you spend pouring your energy into places where you can't make an impact, the more frustrated you are, the more disempowered you are, the more sad and burnt out you are, the more clear you can get about where do I have power? Who can I influence or impact? What systems can I change? Then you start to get those positive feedback loops, which is much more, that's has a way bigger impact for our psyches than the negative ones. So the more you can see, oh, I'm an HR director. I've never audited our time off policies to make sure that they are LGBTQ inclusive. I can do that. Right? I can go online and I can find a checklist. I can, leverage the resources internally and get permission to do this. I have control over that. Done. To change pregnant women to pregnant people, to make sure that your time off policies include foster care, not just adoption or a biological birth. Like, that's really easy stuff. It's low hanging fruit. It could have a huge impact on a trans parent who comes along and needs that time off, or, an LGBTQ plus person who wants to foster a kid, but doesn't understand how they could do it with their job. That's a big impact for those people. And it's way more rewarding than trying to impact something globally. So for me, I just try to stay focused on, what impact can I have now? And then the answer to that question is it's really dependent upon the project. Everything I do, I have a goal. So for example, when I was pregnant with my youngest, we have 2 adopted kids. I gave birth as a transgender man to our youngest child, and I decided to tell my story publicly. And the goal for that was I wanted people to have more hope for trans folks. I wanted them to see that we aren't doomed or destined to any one type of life or outcome. I wanted them to understand how incredibly powerful we are, how much we can do, how much our bodies can do, how much love there is for us. And I knew I succeeded when I got one email. Of all the hundreds that I received, public and negative, I got one email from a woman in the Midwest. And she said she had adopted her niece and nephew just like me. And she said she thought it was amazing that my body could bring new life into this world while also giving me the life that I deserve. And when I heard that, I was like, I did it. That's the whole thing. That's the whole thing, And so I have a goal for everything I do. And then I just look, where's the evidence that it's working or not, and adjust. But to me, using storytelling to change the world, that kind of feedback where I can see people starting to understand the beautiful nuance of holding both, that to me was success.
Really, really powerful. What I love about what you share, Trystan, is that at the moment, what a lot of people are saying to me, just in daily conversations about how hard things are right now, is one of the very common refrains is, there's nothing I can do. And I find that really difficult. And what I love about your framing is if you focus on your sphere of influence, there is actually a lot that you can do. You can't go into the White House and change decisions, change decision makers. You can't do that. But there is actually a lot you can do within your sphere of influence that makes a difference to the people that you work with and interact with and who are watching you on a day-to-day basis. And that is huge. And that does change lives, and it does shape lives.
It really does. And I mean, the bad side is, particularly from my lens, transphobia is everywhere. Yeah. That's a bummer. And it also means we need help everywhere. So if all you can do is to talk to your kids and make sure they're super nice to the kid at school, that they can't really tell if it's a boy or a girl, guess what? That kid needs friends. That's great. That's success. And I think people are like, well, I'm only doing X. Listen, we need everyone doing X. We need everyone doing whatever the thing is that they are good at and can do effectively and make a change in. We need that because kind of the attacks are happening on all fronts right now. And while that's disempowering, it's also empowering, meaning whatever you do, it is helpful. Thank you so much for doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is so incredibly true. So what at the moment is giving you hope? Because I think that holding on to hope is an important part of making it through the day.
Yeah. When it comes to holding on to hope, again, I'm just always looking for the crocus coming up out of the snow as winter ends and spring is coming. Even though it's not spring yet, the crocus has a wisdom that I don't. It knows when we're getting close. So I'm just always sort of looking for those little blooms of things. An example is I did a neurodiversity training 2 weeks ago for a huge organization. 500 people were on this online training. And towards the end, someone in the chat says, that they came out as neurodivergent last year. They've had a really hard time and they didn't think they could stick it out. But this training has given them hope for the future at that organization. Those are little things that I'm like, okay, yes, that's great. I can hold on to that. I can ride that wave for another couple of weeks until the next thing comes along, So it is just intentionally on purpose looking for where's the crocus? Where are the people that are fighting back? Where are those opportunities for connection and community? I'm presenting at a conference next week in Texas. I reached out to the conference organizers and I was like, hey, I'm a trans person. I'm coming to Texas. Texas is leading the country in terms of anti-trans legislation. I'm sure you're already thinking about this, but I hope someone's going to say something from the stage. In my way, I always try to assume the best and, come in a helpful and non-judgy way. And they wrote back within 20 minutes and they were like, yes, we're absolutely thinking about that. We are already planning to say something. We are going to do more research. And if there's anything you would like to make sure we include, please let us know. We would love to include it. So they really balanced. They're not making me as a trans person do all the work, but also they're inviting me into the work. It's both. And so I really appreciate that. And that's an advanced skill, to not be defensive, to not be argumentative. Well, we couldn't have it. They didn't do any of that. They were like, yes, you're totally right. We're on it. Do you want to help? If not, that's okay. And so just seeing that kind of thing, I'm always looking for it. Otherwise, it's easy to get disheartened, or there's I know
so easy. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say, I know you're going to ask me for resources later, but, another place where I get hope is we are the trans community right now, as hard and awful as things are externally, internally, we have never been better. We have the most incredible community leaders, poets, activists, lawyers. I mean, this is, in my mind, this is like the golden age of being trans inside the community. Right, in terms of people who are just visionaries and storytellers. And I mean, it is amazing in here, And so that's giving me hope too. People like Chase Strangio, who's always been my hero, but he's the first trans person to testify in front of the Supreme Court. And he's on social media recording videos, letting us know what's up, telling us not to lose hope, reminding us of our transcestors who've been through worse and came out on the other side, Yeah, so people like that. That's bringing me hope too.
I love that. I love that so much. We are going to go to a quick ad break. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about impact and stories.
Sounds good.
You seeking to create change at the polls? Us too. With Javelina's long history of running winning campaigns, we've learned a thing or two about mobilizing communities. And we know that success isn't about reaching every voter, it's about reaching the right voters. Head over to javelina.co today to sign up for a free consultation and learn how our tailored direct mail services bring voters into your story and drive your campaign to victory. Okay, so I want to ask you about who is most impacted by the work that you do?
I think that's a hard question for me, because in a lot of ways I try to be like Johnny Appleseed. I just plant the seed and I keep moving, and I try not to look back and put too much on, did it work or not? And did people like me or not? Just like I do great work. I plant the seed. I keep moving. I wrote a book about my trans pregnancy experience and what was that like for me, and about our adoption. And I do know from the feedback on that a huge chunk of people who are impacted by my work are parents of trans youth. One of the first things that my mom expressed to me when I came out as transgender is she was really concerned about my future and would I ever be able to find love. I think when a parent loves a child, they want that child to love their child. They want that sort of cycle, the lineage to continue, not biologically necessarily, but just, she wanted the world to love me the way that she did. And I think she was worried that being trans would be a barrier there. And in a way, I wrote my book for her. I wrote my book for every other mom like her who looks at their kid and thinks, oh no, is there a future for you? And I wanted them to see, hell yeah, there is. And it's not always easy. Transphobia exists, especially for, transgender women who are dealing with sexism and transphobia, particularly trans people of color. We get those intersectional identities, and there is absolutely struggle. There's also joy and resilience and power in the community, especially at those intersections, And so I know that's a huge group of people who are impacted by the work that I do. And then I think, certainly my professional work, I think I'm really there for the people who want to be good. They want to be good humans, and they're like, I don't know how. Will you tell me? Like that, to me, that's my ideal client. That's my ideal group. The people who are like, oh, I had no idea. I didn't know what that meant. Thanks for telling me. That humble, open, curious, aren't defensive or guarded. Those are the people I think who get the most out of what I do. I come in and do a training. The people who sit in the front row, that they are the ones. And the people who are brave enough to say, can you say that a different way? I don't think I understand. That open curiosity. I think those are the people that I really impact the most.
It makes me think of what you shared with us at the beginning about that really you do the work of adaptation, and in your materials there was a line in your materials that like really stood out to me, which is great stories and great change begin with a willingness to adapt and grow. And I wrote it down because I just think it's so true. I was like, yes, that's it. That we can't write a great story. We can't participate in a great story. We can't tell a great story, and we can't create change without a willingness to adapt and grow. And I think that sometimes that's actually all it takes. Like you don't have to show up with a plan. You don't have to show up with, an action steps. You don't have to show up having figured it all out, just maybe with a willingness to think differently and to adapt, I guess. Yeah, it just really strikes me. Does that sort of thread through kind of everything you do?
I think so. I think the other thing is, as a professional storyteller, I'm really aware of the science of storytelling and the science of change and persuasion and understanding that change is developmental. There is like a kindergarten, a first grade, a middle school, a high school. You know what I mean? Like you can't throw everything at everyone at once. You have to really understand in general where might this audience be starting? What might they already know about someone like me, or about neurodiversity, or about intercultural, whatever the thing is I'm teaching? What might they know? What might they not know? What might their curiosities be? What might their hangups or bias be? And knowing that ahead of time and being able to, hopefully in a really warm, accessible way, kind of answer their questions before they even have them consciously. I think that is really important. They have to bring a little bit of a curiosity and willingness to learn. And I adapt my work every single day for every audience, telling my story, my trans pregnancy story. Like, I adapted that for every single interviewer I worked with, because the CNN audience is different from a People magazine audience, which is different from a Washington Post audience. Different questions, different values. So yeah, adapting based on that, I think, is the other key piece around the storytelling.
I'm glad that you brought that up. I 100% agree that storytelling is about who you're telling the story for rather than what you're telling a story about. And in our work, one of the most common resistances to that idea is the sense that if you're adjusting your story for different audiences, that you're chipping away at your authenticity. That if you're adjusting it, that you're taking away from its truth. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I hear that all the time. And, I did a coaching session with a deaf woman last year, and we were talking about adaptation, and I asked her, is there an ASL sign for adaptation? And she said, oh, yes. And it is, people listening can't see this, but it's a gear over the heart. So it's your hand as if you're adjusting a gear on your heart. And she said, yes. And it means, you're always you. It's just you to a different volume or on a different channel. And that's how I think about adaptation. Is it's not assimilation. You're not giving up the best parts of yourself to fit in or so that people will like you. You're consciously choosing from an empowered place what part of me, what part of my story, what part of my values is going to help me reach my goal today. Always you, always your heart, just in a slightly different mode. And I find it really empowering to choose or not choose which parts of my story or identity I want to share. I mean, I've done trainings on gender in the workplace for, Hong Kong, Beijing, Singapore. I don't talk about being transgender there, not because I'm ashamed of being trans, not because I think they can't handle it, but because that's not the conversation we're having. We were talking about women in the workplace. I was co-facilitating with a South Asian woman. We're talking about women in the workplace. It doesn't help reach the goal if I also throw in that I'm transgender. It's inappropriate for the cultural conversation. And that's, I have no qualms doing that. That's, an empowered, effective choice that I'm making because I'm there to serve them, not myself. And I think that's the big piece that I ask people is, well, are you telling your story to feel good or make a point or make someone else feel bad? Or are you telling it to serve a greater purpose? So that's kind of the litmus test I try to use. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense. And I think it comes back to this idea of a story is for somebody. And so if you're telling a story for someone, which pieces do they need to know? And coming at that from a place of intention and empowerment, it definitely makes sense. And I think that it also, just makes sense to people when you consider that none of us have one story. We're a collection. We're libraries, right? We're not books, we're libraries. And that when you're picking, not even a book off the library shelf, but you're picking a chapter out of a book, out of a library shelf to tell somebody you can pick a different chapter on a different day with a different goal doesn't make any of the other books not true.
Correct. Sometimes the analogy I use, I love your library, when I often say you have a palette of colors, you get to choose what you're going to paint with them. You don't have to use every color every time. Yeah. And if you're doing, if you want the person that you're working with or the group you're working with to like your painting, you can learn a little bit about the kinds of things they like. Still your colors, still your palette, but it doesn't have to be everything everywhere all at once.
Right. And nor should it be, because then you lose people. They can't connect in. I think your example of leading a training in Asia is a great example. Like, it was parts of my story weren't relevant then and they weren't going to serve the goal. And so they weren't included, not because I wasn't being authentic, but because it didn't serve the purpose of that particular goal and that particular project.
Totally.
So how do these ideas about storytelling for change. How do we layer that over this current moment where there's an incredible amount of chaos and despair and grief and fear, all of which is so legitimate? How do we kind of meet that moment and still use our storytelling skills and prowess to make change, but recognize how deeply people are grieving and feeling fearful?
Yeah, again, another big question. I mean, I'm helping a lot of companies right now where their employee resource groups, their Pride or LGBTQ plus employee resource groups are just gutted. Not because the organization doesn't want to support it anymore. In some cases, that is the case. But in these cases, the organization's like, yes, we're going to keep funding you. We're going to keep supporting you. Gay people are tired. Trans people are tired. We're like, can we really do an extra thing? And I feel like that's a perfect opportunity for allies to step in. One group I've been coaching, a large global corporation, they're like, well, we can't just be an LGBTQ plus group of allies. And I was like, why not? We don't need to be in the room for you to plan Pride programming, for you to find great speakers. If we're tired, that's literally when we need you to keep doing the work. I think about the way that geese travel so many hundreds of thousands of miles is that there's a leader that does all the work and pretty much the others are riding that wind. And when that person, the goose rather, gets tired, it falls to the back and, a different goose steps in. Some of us got to fall to the back right now. And that means it's your turn to lead. And I think a lot of allies have learned, rightfully so, that they shouldn't take the mic. If there's another person who's marginalized who could speak into it, okay, well, what if we don't want to speak? Take the mic, for goodness sakes, Better to do something and even have someone criticize and say, well, there's no LGBTQ people there. Yes, you're right. We're giving them a break. They asked for a break. We're giving them a break. We wanted the work to continue. That's all you can do, right? Better to do something and be criticized for it, I think, than have there be nothing and then it falls apart. So I think if and when people have the resources, absolutely do what you can, respect those who are taking a break, and then really, truly, you have to monitor your own social media intake, news intake. Who are the people you're talking to? Whose texts are you getting and listening and reading? If doom scrolling is empowering to you, if that anger is a clean burning fuel for you, great, keep doing it. If it's not, do not do it. We need you to have some energy to do the work that you feel called to do, that's in your zone of genius and is in your spheres, we need you to do that. And if you're depleting yourself, that's not good for anyone. So I think that's the other thing is, pay attention to your energy levels and adjust accordingly, because everyone, we need you.
Boundaries are important. Boundaries with news, boundaries with social media. So you had referenced before, you're always ready with your list of what can allies do. So if there is anything that you haven't already mentioned on that list, what can the allies do?
Yeah, the sphere of influence is huge. Where can you make a difference? Zone of genius is huge. What are you best at? If you can focus on what are you really good at doing in the places where you can make an impact, that's really, really wonderful to do. Monitoring your energy, which I already mentioned, I think allies feel like, oh, I don't have a right to put a filter up around what kinds of news I can take in and when. That is not accurate. You do not have to subject yourself to something that is going to deplete you and demoralize you, because on the other side of it, you're not doing anything. So who is that for? You know what I mean? You're not helping me by not reading the news. That doesn't help me. You're not helping me by reading the news and getting so despondent that you can't do anything. Don't do that. Be really smart about what you notice is energizing and motivating to you, and what are the things that leave you in bed having a drink at 2 p.m. on a Thursday or whatever. I don't know. I don't know your life. And then the final one, which is kind of a bonus one, I guess, is just about feedback loops. If you're an ally and you're out there doing some work, are there people you can count on to go to and be like, hey, I know I've been posting a lot on Facebook, out of support, in support for the trans community. Is that landing okay? Is there anything different I could be doing? If you're a white leader supervising people of color and you're taking some strides towards, more equitable policies, check in with people can be honest with you. Hey, how's that going? Am I doing a good job? I think we get a little bit stuck on, well, we don't want to force others to educate us. Of course not. That's not what you're doing, though. It's a check-in. How am I doing? Am I showing up in the way that you need? I want you to feel like I have your back. Is this working? Could I do something different? That nice light check-in, I think, is good. And I work with a lot of women who struggle with this. And I tell them, if you had a man that you worked with who came to you, who said, I'm really working on my internalized sexism. I want to make sure I'm not doing anything in the workplace that feels like I'm discounting, dismissing, talking over, taking credit for your ideas. Would you mind letting me know if I do anything that feels like sexism to you? I want to do a great job, and knowing in the moment or afterwards will be helpful. And have I done anything before that hasn't landed right? I would love to learn. You know, if a man were to say that to a woman in the workplace, every woman I've ever worked with has been like, oh my God, that would be amazing. I would love that.
Yes. I mean, you just read my mind. I was like, yeah, I would love that.
You would not be like, how dare you put the emotional labor on me to teach you about sexism? No, it's a humble, open, curious, connective way to show that you want to have their back and you want to do great. And how could you know if no one tells you, you know? So I think thinking about how good that might feel and then flipping it and giving that feeling to another person. Again, that's sort of the 201. Once you got some of the other stuff going on and you're ready to level up, I think checking in with people is really smart and good.
I love that. I think that's phenomenal advice. So when you think about thinking about storytelling, and I've been thinking a lot recently about the story that is being told by this administration. And, you know, it was such a disturbing, I don't know what the adjective is. There's not one that's strong enough. Watching the president's address to Congress when he sort of announced, like, legally there are two genders. And him saying it was one thing. The raucous response from within Congress was quite another. And I thought a lot about the story that is telling. A lot of, you know, everybody who's watching, and that story is being sort of repeated over and over and over. And just how harmful that is on so many levels. And then I've been thinking a lot about sort of counter narrative. And, you know, what's a powerful counter story, and what does it look like to tell that story? And I'm curious, and I'm sure it's a very well articulated question, to be honest, Trystan, but I'm sort of curious, like, how that lands with you and what you think about the best ways to counter such harmful, degrading narratives.
Well, again, it's developmental, you know, and so people who are in that place where they do see trans people as bad and wrong, probably no one listening to this podcast has much power or control over that. You know, there's a certain, the data shows us that there are messages that can reach those people. There are messengers who can reach those people. A lot of us just simply are not. And so I'm not saying we give up on them, but we sort of release them to the universe and hope that at some point in time, someone will reach them, because there's this whole other group of people that see that and they're like, oh, that's gross. I don't know anyone trans. I don't totally understand it, but like that does not feel good in my body to see. And those are the people that stories can really, truly reach, because they are, to your point, they're hungry for a counter narrative, you know? And I think that's what's hard for me and as a trans person in this moment, because I expect that in the trans community, that level of negativity, we see it every single day, everywhere we go. Social media, regular media, public spaces, TV shows, like we've been the butt of the joke. I mean, this is not new to us. That does not hurt me at all. Other people are maybe younger than me. I'm old in trans years, but for me, I'm like, I don't care about that. I think it's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? Who talks about like the silence of the friends hurting more than the attack of the enemy. And I think that's what's really hard, is to see people who have been supportive in the past now being like, oh, actually, no, I don't think that the two transgender kids who've ever wanted to play on a sports team should be able to do so. It's so stupid. So anyway, but your real question is, what are the counter narratives? The counter narratives are, we're just normal people just trying to live our lives. That's like, honestly, the big one is like, we're not trying to like look at you under the bathroom stall. We're not trying to, like, we're just normal people living our lives, is a big one. The sort of, it's got a bad rap, but the normalizing narrative. No, I just heard this dude on a podcast. He's just like a guy with kids in Portland trying to run a business. And now he can't because no one will work with a trans person. We're just normal people is a big one. Again, it sounds icky, but a little bit of a sympathy narrative. That like, it's really sad that this tiny minority of people who has really done very little to hurt anybody ever is being vilified in this way. Do I want people to feel sorry for me? No. Is it one entry point into a larger journey around acceptance? Yeah, absolutely. To feel bad that there's this tiny, like 0.01% of the population with 700 bills against it. During COVID, they were passing anti-trans bills. Kids weren't even in school and they're trying to make sure that a kid couldn't swim on the swim team in a middle school or whatever. We're not even there. Why is this a priority? So the normalizing, they're just regular people. Actually, it's pretty sad that this group of people is being harmed in this way and being attacked in this way. And then for the more wonky people, some of the data, just these are solutions in search of a problem. There, how much energy and resources that could be spent elsewhere being spent to vilify this tiny group of people. It's ridiculous. It's stupid. It's a red herring. It's a false flag, whatever the right thing is. They say on social media, if anyone wants to, says that they care about women in sports and that's why they're trying to keep trans women out, ask them to name 3 female athletes. If they can't, don't listen to that dude. He doesn't care about sports and women. He doesn't care about women. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so there's sort of 3 different ways to approach it. But again, it depends on sort of what stage someone is in. I try to tell stories that hit on all 3 if I can, if I've got a lot of sleep that night before and my kids aren't sick, Yeah,
and you have the mental faculties to pull a story together. Well, speaking of which, you are the author of 2 books, How We Do Family, which is your story, is that right?
Yeah, it's specifically of the family part of it. I wrote a bunch of chapters about my childhood and my editor was like, we don't need these. And I was like, no problem. So yeah, just really about first falling in love as a trans person, which is a story that I never heard or saw as a young person, a young adult. So it's how my partner and I fell in love and then how we ended up becoming parents overnight to my partner's niece and nephew after a year of relationship with each other. Wow. And then how I decided to conceive and carry our youngest, Leo.
And how old is your youngest now?
He's 7. I'm literally, as soon as we're done with this, I'm going to a civil rights museum display and some kind of a tour or something in his classroom in 2nd grade. So he chose women's suffrage because it's the subject of our favorite musical. So the apple has not fallen far from that tree in terms of
Which
my
musical?
son. It's called Suffs, Suffs, Suffs.
I'm not familiar.
It's fantastic. I had a friend in it when it was on Broadway. The soundtrack is amazing. It tells the story of how women got the right to vote, which I thought I knew. I did not know until I saw this show. And I was like, wow, this is amazing and so pertinent to today's times as well. Should we be telling really mainstream, accessible stories that anyone can relate to, but maybe don't quite pack the punch? Or should we be storming the Capitol and demanding our rights, and not backing down and being, burning the president in effigy as they did on the front steps of the White House. So yeah. It's really cool.
That's really cool. I am a big musical person, so I'll definitely check it out. And then you've also written The Light of You, which is a kid's book.
Yeah, my partner and I wrote that together. We were asked by our friends who run a little feminist kids book company in Canada, would we do one about my pregnancy for little kids, age 3 to 5. Really good for educating your kid, just period. Kids learn best through stories. They don't like a lecture. That's true all the way up through 17, I'm learning. So just having it on the bookshelf and they pick it and then they open it up. And I hear from a lot of parents where they're like, it was great. My kid was like, wait, a man can get pregnant? And it is a really good way to open that conversation from them sort of dictating how it's going to go and their curiosity instead of you trying to force something on them. And then parents can say, some men can, most men can't, but some special men can, like this guy, you know, and it's a nice, safe, age appropriate way to have that conversation. And it's in my second grader's classroom, my 7-year-old's classroom right now. His teacher asked if we would donate one to the school, because a lot of kids in his class had questions when he said he had 2 dads, but really no mom. So yeah.
Right.
The book lives
That's
there.
Awesome. It's just the power of story, right? The power of story with who we can reach, and we can call people in from wherever they are. And I just love it. Well, Trystan, I am so grateful to you, not only for your time and your insights for today, but just for the work that you do and how you show up. And I know that it's just an incredibly difficult time right now. And you touched on this at the beginning. We haven't really talked about it, but just from you own a business, you operate a business, and, you know, the sector within which you operate is stalled, is contracting, is in recession. There's been this like very sudden sea change. And so I'm incredibly grateful to you for being so generous with your time and your insights. And I just have some really quick questions to close us out.
Yeah.
The first one is, what if folks who've been listening, they want to learn more, if they learn more about trans advocacy, about social justice, inclusion, where would you send them?
Yeah, I mean, a big part of my book is a primer on trans identities. I just kind of had to include it so that people would understand what I was talking about, you know? And so that's, you know, how we do family is one option. Honestly, right now, we are in a golden age of education around trans issues. You could literally go on TikTok and type in pronouns 101 and you'll get 4 different models of understanding pronouns or trans people. I have a very specific, you know, how to retrain your brain to use gender neutral pronouns, like framework that I created. It doesn't need to be that, you know, and any way in is a great way in. Chase Strangio, as I mentioned already, is definitely someone that people should be following and listening to for a more artistic and poetic approach. Alok Vaid-Menon is an incredible South Asian non-binary poet and storyteller and now stand-up comedian. They have they're doing this whole thing like trans liberation through comedy, which is very fun. Anytime I see Laverne Cox giving an interview, I will listen to it. If you just search your podcast feed for her, you know, obviously she's an actress who became famous during Orange is the New Black. She is like the trans icon that none of us deserve, but that, you know, that we're somehow for some reason getting right now. Just like thoughtful, insightful, brilliant, just, you know, such an incredible person to listen to and to follow, and to whatever she says to jump and I say how high, you know, I would follow her anywhere. So I think it's individual people are doing incredible work right now. The one other is if you go to Substack, there's an amazing trans journalist she does an Erin in the morning, ERIN in the morning. Once a day, you'll get an email saying, here's what's happening to trans people right now. And so that's, if you want to keep your finger on the pulse, that's a good way to do it. And of course, open it when you're ready and you have the capacity, maybe after coffee when you're a little less tender first thing in the morning. But good to know if folks have the ability and want to learn about what's going on.
Those are fantastic. And how about if folks want to think a little differently? What is a way that they can think differently about some of the things we've been talking about today?
I think if there's one thing I'm allowed to say, anytime you find within yourself a bias, to see if you can replace it with a curiosity. That's it. So instead of, you know, trans people are trying to get into sports, how could that be a curiosity? I wonder how many trans people are trying to get into sports, you know? Saying, I wonder why trans people do this. You know, whatever bias you might find, what's the deal with the pronouns? You know, what is the deal with the pronouns? I wonder why someone might not feel like he or she would work for them. You know, if you can just do that tiny little internal work of whenever you've got that assumption, to just soften it a little and just see if you can have room for curiosity instead of judgment. It's just the simplest, most powerful tool that really shifts your brain, because a judgment is rigid. A question is malleable. There's a lot of room in a question. Doesn't have to say you agree with it. Doesn't have to say you accept whatever you're learning about, but you're at least open to learning. And I practice this all the time the other way around. Instead of saying, well, those people are wrong, I try to ask, I wonder why they're so afraid of trans people. I wonder what they are trying to protect. I wonder what's under there. And that keeps me, I think, better connected to other people instead of disconnected to them, which is what I try to do.
And what is one thing that people can do?
What is one new thing that people can do? Oh man, that is a really big one. I think truly, and this is now the third time I've said it, I'm so sorry, but I think truly if people were to pick up a pen and paper right now and write a list of the areas in your life where you could have an impact. And literally, if you are a parent at a school, you can impact that school. If you are someone who knows all of your neighbors, you can impact your neighbors. If you're a parent, you can impact your kids. Even if you are a literal intern at a company, you have some say there. And just literally, what are the areas where I can make a difference? And get really clear on that. And then that next step is, and how can I better support and show up for people who are being attacked right now in these areas? Right? And just have a sense of what can you do? Where can you make a difference? Then that's your to-do list. Even just going to the school and saying, hey, I want to be a good ally to the trans parents and families at this school. Do we have any? Right. Do we have any? Do they need anything? Can I look at the paperwork and make sure that it's inclusive? I still get permission slips in Portland, Oregon with a line for mother and a line for father. Come on. Yeah. Another parent who's not trans could look at that and be like, this isn't good. Yeah. Why don't they call the school? Why do I always have to call the school? I don't want to do that.
Right. You have enough to do.
Exactly. You could ask your kid, hey, is there a bathroom that a non-binary kid could use? There's not. Okay. And call the school and ask why not. You be the pain in the ass. I don't want to always have to do that. I'll do it sometimes. It's a rich tapestry. Sometimes I'm happy to do it. Other times, could someone else please pick this fight?
Well, and I love that because, I think that one of the things that is so difficult just in general, but particularly right now, is people feel like they can't do anything. And what you're saying is actually there's plenty. There is plenty you can do.
So much.
What are your talents? What is your zone of influence? And how can you really sort of advocate within spaces, even if it doesn't directly impact you and your family? There is someone else, someone in your community, someone else's family that you can advocate for.
Yeah. And be creative. I have a giant company I work with. They're a conservative corporation. One of their leaders came to me and said, we can't do any LGBT training this year. I'm so sorry. But what we can do? We can create an LGBT employee handbook that helps employees navigate all the resources we have. Will you do that with us? Absolutely, I will. Right? That's being creative. It's adapting to the given situation instead of just throwing your hands up and being like, well, I guess we can't do anything gay this year. Absolutely, we can. We'll just do something else.
Yeah, we have a lot of clients who are continuing their DEI and LGBT programs that is changing the names. And so that's another thing, if you're listening, that you can consider. Same goals, same content, different language.
And even for the non-LGBT training, I'm a transgender facilitator. I teach on intercultural communication. I can do the entire Brene Brown Dare to Lead frameworks. I'm certified to teach that. I think that's been a problem too, is I think even the other work I do that's not trans specific, I think people are like, yeah, that's the best training we could get. Are we going to become a target if we have a trans person training on this other stuff? And so I think this is a time where if people can be brave and can take that risk, in order to support someone or a group of people who are struggling right now, I think that's another way to do it really creatively.
Yeah. Which leads me perfectly to my last question. Trystan, how can folks connect with you and how can they support your work?
Yeah, well, I'm not on social media in any meaningful way other than LinkedIn. I guess people could find me there. But my consulting firm is called Collaborate Consulting, and it's just collaborate.consulting. That's the website. And then my books and stuff like that are on my personal website, which I don't think I've touched in 2 years, but it's still there, which is tristanreese.com. And either of them can be used if folks are like, yes, this sounds great. Come and teach us this. You can reach me through either of those ways now that I am largely off social media because it's not a safe place for people like me.
Trystan, thank you so much for just everything you've shared with us, for who you are in the world, for this joyful conversation. You've brought me a lot of joy in the time that we've been able to talk to each other, and I know that you will do for those listening as well.
Thanks so much for having me.
There you have it, another incredible conversation. I just absolutely loved everything that Trystan shared. I loved about how he talked about your sphere of influence. It came up a lot in our conversation, this idea of think about where you have influence and then have influence there in your community, with your neighbors, at your kids' school, at your place of work, at your church, where the spaces where you show up and where people listen to you. Make sure that spaces that celebrate inclusion are being created. Make sure that everybody is being invited and treated for the amazing human being that they are. Do any of us have sort of direct impact over the Oval Office of the White House? No. Can we make a meaningful difference in the lives of those around us? Absolutely, 1,000,000% yes. And Trystan gave us not only some really specific ideas about what that looks like, but the inspiration to do so. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for being here. Being a part of this community is what's keeping me going right now, and I consider it to be an absolute privilege to be able to connect with you. If you enjoyed this conversation, I would love if you would do 2 things. 1, leave us a rating and review wherever you listen. It really helps us grow and meet new people, reach new people. And then the other is drop me a line, Catherine@javelina.co. Let me know what you enjoyed. Let me know what you want to hear more of on the podcast on how to change the world. Like I said, the thing that's keeping me going the most is being a part of this community, and we are here to serve you. Until next time, when I cannot wait to share another story of change with you, have a great one.